Volodymyr Zelensky has appeared on the cover of Time magazine, but privately his inner circle know that Ukraine cannot win a war against Russia. The Biden administration know that Ukraine cannot win against Russia. Is Volodymyr Zelensky the only person in the world who doesn't know you can't win a war against Russia? Hello there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on our mutual voyage to truth and freedom. And what a voyage it is. A voyage that involves attacking facts that involve incredible nuance and addressing a really modern and peculiar phenomenon. As you apply celebrity to the world of politics, you find yourself in peculiar situations. From the beginning of this conflict, there was a drive to turn Volodymyr Zelensky into a kind of celebrity, with him turning up at the Golden Globes, being on Letterman, being with his wife in Vogue magazine, because it was necessary to have a central figure to represent the conflict between Ukraine and Russia that was affable and appealing, to rally a population, I mean the American population, behind a very, very expensive campaign that was escalating. And many people said from the beginning, one, was provoked by NATO actions, and two, was unwinnable because Russia are a nuclear superpower, and to beat Russia in a war, you have to go beyond Russia's military capacity. And Russia's military capacity is quite high. You have to ban Russia today from the global internet, or at least platforms that are compliant in that kind of way. And you have to simplify a very complex situation. Ukraine, and of course I'm very supportive of Ukrainian people, like I am of all the people of the world, all of us having our own right to live and our own right to freedom, is a politically complex place. People understand that there's been a lot of corruption in Ukrainian politics. I'm not saying that it's worse than, I don't know, Britain or America or whatever, but I'm saying that people used to commonly say, Ukraine's a bit shaky politically, so if you pump a bunch of money into that place, do be careful. It might not be easy to track and understand. Now, you know we make this show over on Rumble. We stream at these times every day. We have guests. We do all sorts of fantastic stuff. It's worth joining us live for the live stream because we respond to our audience there live and make the show according to your wishes. I'll see you over there. Let's get into the celebritification of Volodymyr Zelensky, the simplification of a complex war, and how we're going to extricate ourselves from a very expensive and dangerous geopolitical situation now that it's started.
The strategy of this war this summer, and you reiterated right now, the progress has been slower than desired.
It's a very modern and unusual war where media has been utilized in a very unusual way. Like, you don't normally see leaders on the TV turning up at the Golden Globe, Sean Penn giving an Oscar to a leader. It's not a normal thing, is it? Remember, previous allies of the kind of interest we're talking about do include people like Colonel Gaddafi. He used to be a big ally of Western nations like ours, but you didn't have him turn up at the Oscars. I mean, the closest he got to movies was when he was tragically murdered, and it looked like Weekend at Bernie's.
And recently, one of your top generals said Ukraine has, quote, reached a stalemate. Has the war reached a stalemate?
The world gave us 3 days. Some European countries who really believed in us, they said 1 month.
I'm not questioning the fortitude of Ukrainian people. I know some Ukrainian people. They are really, really hard, tough people. This isn't about that. I think what's happened is that Volodymyr Zelensky's had a kind of a Truman Show created around him, where he's been told, you're going to win this war, we're going to support you, we're going to give you military aid, 70% of which will end up going to military-industrial complex, and many of the weapons might get lost elsewhere and not even make it to Ukraine. I feel that Volodymyr Zelensky's been a pawn in a much bigger game, to tell you explicitly what I think that game is, to drain the resources of Russia, to try to establish Ukraine as a kind of outpost of American empire, to create a sort of unipolar world where Russia and China get agitated into conflicts that are draining, to benefit the military-industrial complex by having long, drawn-out wars that don't have any realistic aim. I mean, has anyone ever explained to you, right, what'll happen is, we'll do this, then this will happen, then Russia will surrender and the white flags will come out. You know, the people have talked about regime change, but there's no real plan for the point where Russia goes, well, that is enough about that. You know, Russia are hard. They are built in war. The last century's been war for them. It's a different type of mentality. It's not something that's going to be easily resolved. And I think in turning Volodymyr Zelensky into a kind of celebrity leader, which is extraordinary because, of course, he was an actor and comedian previously, he's been inundated with a version of reality that's kind of untenable, almost gaslit into believing this was a war that could be won. But how do you win a war against Russia? What surprises me is what a pundit or an uninformed person might think about going to war with Russia. Like, how are you going to win a war against Russia? They've got nuclear weapons. They've got a long history of winning wars against, like, formidable opponents like Napoleon and Hitler and stuff. How are you going to beat them in a war? Like, that seems to be bearing out. How has it happened? Well, it seems to me because there was was a fictitious narrative created around this conflict from the beginning, a mobilization of the legitimate humanitarian crisis that was happening to Ukrainian people, which ignored the complexities of how the war actually started, NATO's impingement on former Soviet Union territories, the provocation of Vladimir Putin, and the fact that it's a war against an unbeatable opponent.
If there is a question through society of United States about military and about something else, okay, let's co-produce it. It will be win-win. The third one, if you can't give us some financial support, okay, please give us a credit and we will give you back money after the war.
Well, so this is essentially a pitch for more military aid, a negotiation at the level of the media for more funding, even for it to become a debt rather than a donation. That's extraordinary, actually. And I suppose what Zelensky might be sensing is that the Biden administration are losing their appetite for the ongoing funding of this war, perhaps in favor of other potential conflicts in the Middle East and increasing tensions with China. But it's a very unusual media appearance. Obviously, at the beginning of this war, there was a great deal of goodwill and a lot of badges and stickers and all kinds of fanfare. But now I think people are exhausted and people are beginning to realize that their taxpayer dollars are being spent on a war that can't be won.
And the force, we can buy some ammunition. We will buy. We will defend our jobs. We will have taxes and we will buy. We will buy from American companies. Just allow us. And that's it.
What? This is really weird. When did war become about making deals in such an explicit way? Maybe it's always been like that. Let me know in the comments.
Time is very expensive. That's why we need your support. But you will get more. You will get more. I'm sure. After our win, you will see all these things.
It's actually difficult not to feel a little sympathy for Volodymyr Zelensky, who I feel may have been used in a pawn in a geopolitical game that far expands his understanding of that conflict. I don't know. Let's get into it. Since the Russia-Ukraine war began over 20 months ago, Western media has constructed and dutifully hewn to a series of narratives. Volodymyr Zelensky is a war hero and a resistance leader akin to Winston Churchill. Ukrainians are eager to volunteer for the war effort, while Russians flee conscription. More money and weapons are all the Ukrainians need to retake the territory Russia has annexed. The West's interests lie in helping them achieve that grand victory rather than in pushing for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement. Facts at odds with these narratives, such as that Ukraine has been taking unsustainable losses in combat, that we don't have enough artillery shells to adequately supply them, that the billions we've been sending to Ukraine are falling prey to corruption, have been dismissed as Putin talking points. The critics who point them out are attacked as Kremlin apologists. I think this is where the role of independent media becomes significant, because now you will hear reports of corruption within Ukraine. You're continually invited to consider the complexity of even the humanitarian support of a nation under attack, that much of the military aid might end up in the wrong hands. If you're around my age, you'll remember that the aid that was sent to Ethiopia during the famine potentially ended up in the hands of warlords. It's a complicated world, and the attempts to simplify it in the interests of propaganda, and by propaganda I mean simplified narratives that advance the interests of the powerful, propagated by the mainstream media in order to dampen down conversation. Now the complexity is beginning to rear its head. You can't beat Russia in this war. There is corruption within Ukraine. There was provocation prior to the advent of this war, and now it seems like popular support is beginning to wane. The complexity can't be ignored, particularly with the kind of reporting that's available now. You can't maintain simple, popular narratives that are meant to drive essentially what seems like a financial deal. All of which is why it was so extraordinary to read last week's cover story in Time magazine. Written by Simon Schuster, who previously wrote the article naming Zelensky's Times Person of the Year at the end of 2022. The piece is ostensibly another hagiography of Zelensky as the heroic figure forced to go it alone as times get tough and Western allies start to abandon abandon him. But rather than shoring up Zelensky's standing in the West, it validates many of the criticisms made by those supposed Putin apologists. Only now, those criticisms are being voiced by Zelensky's own aides and advisors inside the presidential palace. And amidst all these military crises, it's certainly worth considering how safe you'll be if things escalate to the point where they affect us all. That's why it's an important time to mention the wellness company. Nearly 90% of pharmaceuticals in the US are produced abroad. In a global crisis, countries could restrict exports and stockpile medications. This, of course, can lead to raising drug prices and empty shelves across America. Statistically, you or a family member will likely need a prescription in the next year, regardless of supply chain issues. The wellness company's medical emergency kit offers you a solution to be prepared without paying thousands for a hospital visit. Their kit contains 8 essential medications, including antibiotics, antivirals, and antiparasitics, including ivermectin. It's like having a pharmacy in your bathroom or wherever you need it. Visit twc.health/brand to get your medical emergency kit. Use the code BRAND for a 10% discount at checkout. All right, let's get back to the conditions that mean that we all need a pharmacy in our kitchen or bathroom or wherever you're going to put it. The narrative dam our media has built around the reality in Ukraine is apparently breaking wide open, and the truth is finally spilling out. Ukraine's war aims are unrealistic. Kiev has long maintained that its definition of victory, namely the retaking of all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, is achievable with Western arms and money. Now, a disastrous summer counteroffensive, which has resulted in horrific Ukrainian casualties while reclaiming negligible amounts of territory, has Zelensky's advisors reconsidering whether those aims are realistic. Yet Zelensky's belief in ultimate victory over Russia has only hardened into a form that worries some of his advisors, according to Schuster, who describes Zelensky's faith as immovable, verging on the messianic. In this context, messianic faith is perhaps ill-advised. What you start to wonder is, would a peace deal that was initially proposed and apparently on the table prior to hostilities advancing to the degree that they have been much more favourable? I suppose if there are people within Zelensky's own government that are starting to talk about changing the aims, that's diplomacy, isn't it? That's negotiation. One of Zelensky's closest aides tells Schuster that he is delusional. We're out of options. We're not winning, but try telling him that. This, of course, runs counter to all the propaganda pumped out by Ukraine and repeated by Western media sources. But increasingly, it's only Zelensky who still believes his own press clippings. Staggering casualties have decimated the Ukrainian army. Ukraine has refused to disclose casualty counts throughout the war, dismissing the increasingly credible reports of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian casualties as Russian propaganda. But another close aide to Zelensky tells Schuster that casualties are so horrific that even if the US and its allies come through with all the weapons that they've pledged, we don't have the men to use them. Schuster reports that in some branches of the military, the shortage of personnel has become even more dire than the deficit in arms and ammunition. According to the article, the average age of a currently serving Ukrainian soldier is 43 and getting older all the time. It appears the youth have already been sacrificed. Whilst in one regard this is a very modern war, with a leader being turned into a celebrity, with propaganda, immersively used social media talking points and campaigns being used to prevent counter-narratives emerging. The idea that you're a Putin apologist if you dare to criticize the agenda of the establishment. It's also a normal war where in the end you run out of people. I mean, the analysis that was offered of Russia's ultimate victory over the Nazis, and I know there's a lot more military complexity than I'm able to offer you, was that in the end, Stalin had more men. Stalin will just keep throwing human beings relentlessly at the front. And that seems to have happened here. So with all the military support in the world, you're running out of human life. Conscription policies are draconian. Another fact dismissed as a Putin talking point is that Ukrainians have had to resort to ever more draconian conscription policies to replenish their military's ranks. Schuster lays out the unpleasant reality. New recruitment is way down. As conscription efforts have intensified across the country, stories are spreading on social media of draft officers pulling men off trains and buses and sending them to the front. Those with means sometimes bribe their way out of service, often by paying for a medical exemption. The corruption became so widespread that Zelensky fired the heads of all the regional draft offices in August. But the move backfired as a lack of leadership brought new recruitment nearly to a halt. Sometimes I feel like you require an initial wave of optimism and positivity to deal with a very difficult situation. But in the end, the inevitability of reality has to be faced. It seems that there's just not enough people, not enough goodwill, not enough military support available, just not enough human beings to sustain an unwinnable war. And eventually that's going to have to be faced. And when that eventually is faced, questions like, was this a futile endeavor from the beginning, will have to be answered. Should the diplomatic opportunities, the Minsk Accords, etc., have been accepted when they were a possibility? What was the point of the interceding years, the expenditure and the loss of human lives? Who really benefited? Morale is collapsing. Even patriots don't want to die serving as cannon fodder for a doomed military strategy. Within the officer ranks, there is growing dissension bordering on mutiny. One close Zelensky aide complained to Schuster that some frontline commanders have begun refusing orders to advance even when they come directly from the office of the president. It's in a very good cover piece that he's done for Time magazine. Normally that's like, make me sound good, will you? Yeah. The conscription's gone out of control. No one's listening to you. He wants to talk to his PR agent. When Schuster asked a senior military officer about those complaints, the officer said that some officers have no choice but to refuse orders that are simply impossible. He told a story about an order in early October to retake the city of Holivka, a strategic outpost in eastern Ukraine that's been under Russian control for almost a decade. The answer came in the form of a question, writes Schuster. With what? With no recruits and no artillery, Zelensky's dreams of driving the Russians from every inch of Ukrainian territory cannot be achieved. He can only fight futilely to the last Ukrainian, and there is a diminishing number of Ukrainians willing to die in the service of that strategy. Corruption is uncontrollable. It's long been a Putin talking point that Ukraine's government was shot through with corruption. And yet Zelensky has been getting an earful about exactly that from its US and NATO allies, who don't want to see their billions of dollars in aid disappear into the pockets of corrupt officials. Zelensky has taken some actions, like the sacking of his Minister of Defense, Oleksiy Reznikov, for corrupt procurement practices. But to really root out corruption, Zelensky will have to fire most of his government. A top presidential advisor admitted as much to Schuster once his audio recorder had been shut off. People are stealing like there is no tomorrow. It sounds like a lot of people within Ukrainian government recognise that this is a doomed endeavour and see it simply as an opportunity for corruption and an opportunity to potentially make personal gain. But when a war is presented in the simplistic terms and the peculiar Hollywood terms that this one was, ignoring nuance, ignoring complexity, the complexity of its origins, the complexity of the opponent, how else was it ever going to end? Sooner or later, reality comes to the surface. Nobody believes in our victory like I do, Zelensky told Time in what became the pull quote for this cover story. He may have to read Schuster's piece to see just how right he is, as he seems surrounded by aides who no longer believe in Ukraine's war strategy or Zelensky's leadership of it. Zelensky no doubt intended the quote as a Churchillian never surrender exhortation to courage and resolve in the face of Ukraine's darkest hour, rather than as an admission of delusional optimism. Yet his dogmatic insistence on total victory and refusal to consider peace negotiations belie a loss of touch with reality that ought to worry both his countrymen and allies. It must be an incredible situation to be in, to have been a popular leader, feted by the global media and establishment, funded in a war against a superior opponent, and then to watch that erode with the kind of inevitability that is underscored, I suppose, by deals with BlackRock after the war. And when you sort of see how Zelensky's talking on Meet the Press or whatever that propagandist piece he was trying to rally on, where he's saying, we can just borrow that, we'll just borrow the money, we'll give you the money back, you'll be able to rebuild Ukraine. It seems like there was an odd collision of the war being presented as a humanitarian effort of plucky Ukraine versus evil Russia. And over time, you can't sustain that reality. It seems that the fact that there is corruption in the Ukrainian government, like there are, I suppose, in most governments, has led to the hemorrhaging of resources. And now he stands as a lone figure trying to fulfill a role he was cast in, a role he was required for by the global establishment that they no longer really need him to play. It looks like this conflict will either become something entrenched that absorbs money in a less dramatic way over future years, in a Julian Assange, we like long wars type way, or it'll quietly be ushered away. But what it's not going to be, I don't imagine, is a resounding and surprising victory victory for Ukraine against the superior military might of Russia. To be sure, Zelensky is not alone in his refusal to face reality. The Biden administration has proposed another $61 billion for Ukraine's war effort without explaining how this would produce a different result than the $100 billion already appropriated. Yeah, that's been an extraordinary feature of this war, isn't it? Asked on the basis of kind of kindness and support and loyalty and important values to continue to support this war, but no one ever explains, look, all we have to do really is retake this area or win this strategic battle. No one can say that, because I think actually the independent media take, which is, hold on a minute, they're just using this war to siphon money towards the military-industrial complex and drain Russia, knowing ultimately it's an unwinnable war. That's the truth of the matter. Undoubtedly, Zelensky's optimism was fueled by Biden's repeated promises of total support for as long as it takes. Wow, man. He's just been chewed up by the machine, hasn't he, Zelensky? Like a career politician like Joe Biden will just say whatever's necessary when it's necessary to say it, and when it's necessary to say something else like, we're not supporting Ukraine anymore, he'll say that. They're incredible at managing those situations. Just notice that prior to this war, the idea of provoking Russia was just overtly described as unfeasible because it could lead to World War III. And now we find ourselves in this situation, or Saudi Arabia will be a pariah. That's what modern politics is. It's just expedience. It's just say what you need to say when it's necessary to say it. And Zelensky, who's probably an idealist, he probably doesn't understand how the global political game works. Who does? I'm not claiming that I do. Has just been sucked into it. And it's just like he's a convenient component for a while, and he'll be spat out like so many former allies of the establishment when it's convenient to do so. But it's becoming increasingly clear that the US is in no position to deliver on that promise indefinitely. It has too many other global commitments, including to Israel, which compete for limited resources. Remember on 60 Minutes when Biden goes, we're the United States, for Christ's sake, biggest country in the world, best country in history.
We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world.
Well, you know, in the end, reality becomes unignorable. Alone among his team, Zelensky seems not to understand how circumstances have changed. Schuster and Time try their best to portray him as the last stalwart of the Ukrainian cause, but the fact that his own inner circle is the source of the torrent of revelations and complaints suggests that his immovability owes not to Churchillian resolve, but rather to an impervious bunker mentality. So this Times story, which in a way is the apex of turning Zelensky from a politician into a celebrity, even though he was a celebrity before he was a politician, seems to be revealing what many people long suggested. People like Jeffrey Sachs and other academic analysts said Ukraine can't win a war against Russia. It's unwinnable. What's happening here is opportunistically Zelensky and Ukraine are being exploited, probably to trial weapons so that BlackRock can do deals in some sort of subsequent rebuilding, and he'll be used as a kind of celebrity of the day while it's convenient, and discarded when the war is regarded as unwinnable or no longer useful, or has expired as something to galvanize public opinion or legitimize the use of taxpayer dollars and the funneling of taxpayer dollars towards the military-industrial complex. Zelensky is probably a man with integrity, even though there are a lot of stories that elections are being suspended and that there's a lot of corruption within Ukraine and that his military strategies aren't working. Seems to me that this is what happens when war is simplified, when war is used to galvanize public opinion and to redistribute public resources. In the end, you have to face reality that a war against Russia is a very, very serious proposition. That you can't ignore Russia's counter narratives any more than you can ignore their counter-offensives simply by banning Russia Today from YouTube, because the reality will come out. Russia is a massive country with nuclear arms, a long, powerful, significant military history, with historic ties to Ukraine that they were willing to negotiate a diplomatic solution to, which increasingly seems favourable now that the propaganda is starting to dissipate and global attention is starting to turn to other potentially lethal apocalypse-inducing wars. And Zelensky alone on the cover of Time magazine is left pleading for more time that eventually will run out. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments and the chat? Remember, we do this show live every day at these times. Join us for the stream. More important than any of that, though, if you can, please stay free. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.